Good afternoon and welcome to Philanthropy Impact's Walk in My Shoes series, where today we're going to be exploring making societal change, the role of campaigning in philanthropy. My name is Sophia Sahanek and I'm your moderator for today. This series has been produced to bring interesting, thought-provoking and relevant discussions to our audience each week. As a not-for-profit membership organisation, it is our aim to increase and improve philanthropy and social investment, and also to encourage impact investing. If you'd like to know more about what your membership brings, how we can collaborate, or about the training programmes we offer, please get in touch with me in the chat today. I'll also share my email there. These Walk in My Shoes sessions are meant to be a fast-paced, concise discussion around pertinent topics in this space. As such, they are strictly 30 minutes. However, we do encourage audience interaction. We do that via the chat function, so please do introduce yourselves, give us your thoughts and pose questions to our panel that way. If you'd like to interact, please make sure to add panel and all attendees when you type out and be respectful to all throughout. Today, we have invited our panel to come and talk about the important role of campaigning and to highlight how they're approaching this with their grant making. Our CEO, John Pepin, has once again kindly agreed to chair this session, so thank you, John. And joining him, we welcome Debbie Pippard, who's the Director of Programmes at Barrow Cadbury Trust, Philanthropist Lady Edwina Grosvenor, who is founder and chair of charity One Small Thing, and finally Sue Tibballs, CEO of Sheila McKechnie Foundation. I hope I said that right. Thank you all for taking your time to share with us today, and I will now hand over to John to make a start. Thank you, John.
Thank you. I'm looking at the window and I see this bright light coming in. I'm not sure what it is. Can someone tell me what that is?
A big yellow frightening thing in the sky, John.
Yeah, I know. It's really weird. Should I put a hat on or something? Anyway, thank you, everyone, for joining us. The topic today is around campaigning, lobbying, or whatever term you wish to use. And we see it as an essential part of achieving societal good. There are issues in the sense it's underfunded, seen as always priority by philanthropists, but it can have major effect. So you have, we do a lot of campaigning around tax relief, and that hopefully allows for more giving, but also start to address issues around income inequality. There's been a lot of campaign around tobacco, which has successfully dealt with a number of health issues. You had seatbelt campaigning in the past, and that dealt with safety issues. And then there's a whole range of things going on around racial and gender equity. So maybe I could start off by asking the three panelists, starting with Debbie. Debbie, can you talk about, as a funder, why a trust or foundation would be involved in supporting campaigning, and should philanthropists also be seeing this as one of the priorities for funding?
Thank you, John. Barrow Cadbury is, we're not a very large foundation. We're a family-run foundation still, set up 101 years ago, and with a Quaker heritage. And one thing about the Quakers is that they've always tried to address the root causes of a problem rather than try to alleviate the symptoms and the manifestation of the problem. So that goes right back to our givers. They didn't want to just give money to deserving poor. They wanted to change the conditions in which people lived so that they could make it a permanent change. So the reason why we're involved in campaigning and advocating for structural change more generally is that it has a lasting impact. If you can change the roots, you can change the future. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and it's very much linked to this, is that prevention is much better than cure. So again, if you can go a bit more upstream, get away from the direct services, which are extremely important, but you can change things for the better. Services tend to be very expensive, and so if you've got a limited budget and you want to achieve something, thinking about change, about campaigning, about good practice, about how things can be done better is we think it's a really smart way of spending a limited amount of money, because some of those campaigns that you talked about, John, there wasn't huge amounts of money that went into them, and look at the impact that they've had. It's been really remarkable. And the last thing I'll say, because I know time's really tight, is that change, it takes a long time. That's a pretty obvious statement. It takes a long time to achieve change, to build up a case, and then sometimes you need to spend some more time kind of sustaining that change. And so it's perfectly suited to private philanthropy, because as private philanthropists, you have control over your own money. You can decide that you're interested in an issue, you want to make a real difference, and you're interested in sustaining that funding over a period of time. There are too many sort of structures in our society which go on a cycle, whether that's a political cycle, a trustee, the length of time the trustee spends in a role, the churn of trustees where perhaps priorities change. As a private philanthropist, people can choose to focus on a particular area where they've got a real passion and gain a huge expertise in it. So you become part of the change that you want to make. That's also a very satisfying way of working.
So it's less expensive to treat things from a campaigning perspective than it is to treat major health issues.
Absolutely.
If that's true, then why is it there's so little compared to other kinds of donations put into campaigning, Debbie?
I think there are many answers to that, so I'll pick a couple of things. One is, I think, some anxiety about it. Sue might talk a little bit more about this, but of course, we're a charitable foundation. If you're thinking about charitable funding, all campaigning has to be non-party political. It doesn't mean it can't try to influence the political leadership, but it can't be party political campaigning, and that's a bit of a technical difference, but which we might not want to go into. We might want to go into a bit later on. So that's one thing. I think some anxiety about it. The second thing is that I think sometimes it comes a bit later on in the philanthropic journey. So at the beginning of a philanthropic journey, you can see a need, you want to address that need. We've seen it in COVID, people put a lot of money, a lot of generosity into meeting that dreadful need. But what we've seen is that there needs to be structural change. COVID's lighted on people who could least afford to sort of least well equipped to deal with it. And so we need longer term funding that will support and sustain change, so that next time something comes along, we don't fall down the same hole.
Okay, well, thank you. We lost you there for a second. Okay, so Debbie's using different terms. I use different terms: lobbying, campaigning, etc. Can you sort of give us some background about these different terms or the relevance, etc.?
Yes, that's right. It's sort of an area that I think is quite complex, and it's sort of contested, as Debbie says, and people get quite anxious about it. Just briefly to say, so at the Sheila McKechnie Foundation, our interest is in building a more powerful and confident civil society that can drive change, at the heart of which is understanding how change happens, and as part of that, the role that campaigning plays. And people that may know Sheila McKechnie was herself a highly effective campaigner. She was at Shelter and then at what we now call Which. And it's true to say that certainly if you were to ask the public what campaigning means, they'd probably think of an advertising campaign, or they might think of a party political campaign. So there's already a slight disconnect, because in the social sector, we think of campaigning and we either would think about campaigning to influence decision makers, so what you might call advocacy or lobbying, or you might think of campaigns to raise awareness. So for example, Time to Change, the big mental health campaign. And certainly the lobbying piece is the bit that makes people anxious, because it is sometimes presented as being political in a way that is somehow unacceptable. As Debbie says, it is entirely legitimate for charities or any not-for-profit to have political views. We're precluded from being party political, but those two things get elided, and there's a sort of anxiety that in being political, we're sometimes somehow going to cross the rules that the Charity Commission sets. And to be honest, it's true to say that the current administration have been anxious about charity campaigning and introduced measures like the Lobbying Act, and they're called anti-advocacy clauses, but they've attached clauses to contracts to try and reduce the amount of conversation between the sector and government. So there is a tension between civil society or the social sector and government, and there always has been, in truth. But what I wanted to do was just slightly step back, because if you ask yourself how social change happens, rather than just ask about campaigning, it's interesting that we can see that campaigning is itself still only a small part of a much wider set of activities that drive change. And at root, change starts from the simple belief that things can or should be better or different. Whether that's through some direct injustice, you think about somebody like, I don't know, Doreen Lawrence and the loss of her son, or whether it's we bear witness to things that we don't think are acceptable. Think of the great pressure around climate, which is from people just recognizing there's a problem. And it's about building the evidence and making the case and building the pressure of support around you. So social change starts from experience, and it's all about then attracting people to join with us to make ideas that were initially unpopular, not just popular, but that they prevail. And whether it's abolishing slavery or securing equal marriage or the living wage, most significant social change has started in civil society. So the idea that our job is simply to speak truth to power, as it's often characterised, and to petition government isn't quite right, because governments are themselves also very influenced by public pressure. And I think a really clear-cut example of that we've seen over the last year is Marcus Rashford, who has used his extraordinary reach on social media and profile as a footballer to actually, you know, cause the government to do quite a few U-turns. So there's a much more complex set of things going on. I think what's particularly interesting about the UK setting is that we're very much defined by the conception of charity. So as well as campaigning being seen at times as being somewhat almost illicit, we sort of think about our sector as being about picking up the pieces. Charity understood in quite a Victorian way. You know, we sort of hand out the soup, we provide the refuges and so on. And of course we do that, we provide that relief. But what's being slightly lost is that we are much more really a place of reform. We're about change, whether that's turning an individual life around or trying to affect the kind of deep-rooted structural change that Debbie's talking about. And for a whole host of reasons, the sector is being more defined really by its role in relief. And exactly as you described, John and Debbie, and for philanthropists, and I can entirely see why, it's really easy to think it's much easier to put your money into funding solutions, to sort of ways of making things easier, rather than funding the activity that might stop those problems arising in the first place. So suffice to say, of course, I would absolutely encourage all of you to recommend to clients and contacts that funding social change work, transformational reform work is really valuable, whether or not you use the term campaign. And just to give some examples as a sector, it's really interesting actually, because in the United States, there's quite a big industry that helps civil society there understand how to build its capacity to drive change, whether that's organisations like the Frameworks Institute who help understand how to get messaging right so you can influence the public, really important in this kind of polarised media world that we're in, whether it's about forming coalitions. So one of the things that decision makers would say about the sector, which I'm sympathetic to, is that we don't come together into coalitions and group together so that they hear not many voices, but one voice on one issue. I'm sure, Edwina, you'd be familiar with some of that around your area of work. It's very hard to get sectors to work together sometimes. We need help to develop policy. We often lack capacity just to do really good policy work. And then that's right, it's how do we build constructive relationships with decision makers, which, by the way, it's not the case that they're always uncomfortable relationships. And, you know, might just say that in my 30 years of campaigning, if there was one quality that I think would define a good campaigner, it's about relationship building. And basically being able to find, you know, that there's somebody that doesn't share your views, and your challenge is to persuade them that, you know, either that they personally agree or often that there's something in it for them to share those views. So campaigning is also a much gentler art than it's often understood to be, because we think about protest and we think about the noisy stuff. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour. There's much more that my organisation has that would help set that out in much more detail if it's piqued anyone's interest, but I shall leave my contribution there for now.
You can put your contact details into the chat, and then people can pick up on that if they wish to.
Great.
Good, thank you. I want to sort of agree with you around collaboration. I mean, I spent most of my working life in Canada. I've been here for 20 years, but before that, we did a lot of campaigning, and the success of it was because different organizations and different groups actually worked together. We might have had somewhat different opinions sometimes, but we managed to work out an approach to do that. And I found that working in local communities in the UK, it was really difficult to get people to work together. And it seems more like a unitary kind of approach in this country. So I agree that I think that's one of the weaknesses. Edwina, you've been so patient sitting there. Maybe I can ask you, as a founder and as a funder, if you could explain your journey, why you've done what you've done, and give people a sense of what your passion is.
Yeah, thank you. So I suppose it's better not to beat around the bush. And for those of you who don't know, I was born into great wealth, into a very wealthy family. So that meant that growing up, there was this sort of thing hanging over my head, which was I knew that at some point I was going to be in a position to have lots of money, and certainly not to get the violin out early on or even later on, because I don't expect that. There's a sort of mindset that you have to grapple with in order to understand what that means and what you might then do with what is being gifted to you. So at a very, very young age, both my parents decided that they were actually quite worried about drugs, me growing up as a teenager and having access to money and what might happen. So they took me and my older sister to a drug rehabilitation clinic on Hope Street in Liverpool. And they thought it was best not to try and educate me and my older sister about drugs themselves, because we probably wouldn't have listened. And we sat down with 2 heroin addicts for about an hour. I was about 13 years old, and my older sister a couple of years older. And it was the first time in my life that I sort of understood the others, if you like. I don't like that term, but that's where I was. I was 13 years old, and I just found it the most interesting hour of my life. I thought, why have I not been taught about this at school? Why don't people sort of talk about this? And I was able to sit with these 2 people, and they were able to tell me about their lives and why they were taking heroin and why they were trying to get off the heroin. So there's much more I could say about that, but it really was a crucial moment in my life where the sort of giving and the doing started to sort of, you know, hit each other in quite a closer way. So then I decided, because I was living in this sort of beautiful house that kind of resembled a palace, and I knew my life was very different to others, and I thought, God, this is so unfair. I'm being given all this, you know, I've got every chance in life. Other people are given so little, or other people have so little, and they don't really have a chance. How can I try and balance the scales with what I have and what others need? And that's really been the theme of my life since then. I went on at the age of 15 to work in an organisation called Save the Family. So that was about mothers being kept together with their children as a last-ditch attempt before the children were being removed into care. As I say, I was about 15, and there were lots of children there my age. And again, I thought, this is so unfair. These children just really don't have much of a chance. I later went to work in Nepal, and and I came towards the prison system in Central Jail in Kathmandu. And so really everything was kind of revolving around crime as well. And it's like, oh, so if you have great wealth and you're really lucky, the chances are you're probably not going to get caught up in crime. Of course, some do. But the theme of criminal justice, which has been with me in the area that I've been working in now for 22 years, really all stemmed from that. There's sort of, you know, Hope Street, the heroin addicts, the mothers a lot of the mothers' husbands and boyfriends were in prison, the children were getting out of control. So that was the theme, really. To cut to being 25, I'm now about to turn 40, so it was a while back, but to cut to being 25, that's when my trustees and the people around me, they were like, right, this is the age where you sort of get it all. And I was like, okay, great. Still a bit confused as to what really all of that means. But to distill it down really into something more simple, I thought, instead of being a victim of my wealth, which actually is quite an easy place to find yourself in if you're not careful, I thought, I've been given a great gift. This is a great power. I can actually mix my expertise, my passion, what I want to do, and I can become a career philanthropist. So I actually decided to tackle the sort of wealth and my philanthropy and sort of be like, no, this, you know, you're coming with me. You're not going to dictate to me my life. I'm going to use you with my expertise and my knowledge. And to have that sort of wealth and that gift behind me, and maybe behind my campaigns and behind my my knowledge, is a really brilliant, wonderful gift that I'm very thankful of. And I really enjoy being a philanthropist, because also when I travel, I go into prisons. My husband's a historian, Dan Snow, and when we used to go on holiday together, he would always want to find a battlefield. I always want to find a prison to go into. So our holidays are sort of quite entertaining in that sense. But yeah, that's really the sort of the arc of my journey.
So you're going through prison withdrawal right now then?
Yeah, do you know what? It's been over a year since I've been in a prison, and it's the longest I've ever not been in a prison since I was 18. So yeah, that was 22 years ago, and that's quite a big deal for me. It's,
there are lots of questions, but I have a couple of questions. Edwina, there's all kinds of negative media now about lobbying and ex-politicians, do you think that this will have an impact on funders? And because someone mentioned earlier about risk, so do you think that this will have an impact on funders? So why would I, as a funder, want to support something when I could support a local thing in my community? Why would I want to support campaigning when it's sort of a dirty word these days in the political sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to separate a few things out. I think, you know, prisons in particular are very political, and you can't really sometimes take the politics out of it. But what you can do is use your brain and your nous to kind of navigate what's going on. There's still safe places to give. There's still brilliant people around. I think there's more honest people around than there are dishonest people. And I suppose that's about due diligence. And when I'm speaking about philanthropy, I often say, when people say, how do you decide what to give to or not? I say, well, you know, you've got your brain, you've got your heart, and you've got your gut. And sometimes I totally give from my head, and sometimes I totally give from my gut. And not my head, or sometimes it's totally heart driven. Sometimes I will just really like the chief executive, so I'm not too bothered about what goes on, in the sense that I sometimes want to back people. Sometimes there's something quite good, but there's something about the CEO that actually I genuinely just don't sort of feel is right. So it's very, very personal, but I think there's ways to sniff out, you know, fishy things that might be going on. Not always. You know, you can't always sort of find out what's going, but I think it's important to say from my point of view as well, when I was in my late 20s, mid-20s, I looked into setting up a foundation. I decided not to, because I wanted to be able to give fast, and I'm an expert in my field, and I didn't want, makes me sound really controlling, I didn't want a load of trustees who knew less about the area to then stop me from giving my money to the areas that I wanted to give to. And the final thing to say on that is also, I want to be able to give to things that aren't registered charities. And that's been a really important theme of my giving. And I've been able to be much more innovative, and I think I've been able to be much more impactful. I think part of being a philanthropist is to be able to help people out of a tight hole. So if someone's actually going under and you want to be able to help them, it's no good saying, well, you can wait 6 months till my next trustee meeting, because actually life is sometimes a bit more hectic than that. So I always thought, well, when the need arises for me to set up a foundation, I will, and still 20 years on, that hasn't happened.
Well, there's a parallel for you, if you want, an excellent model, and Dame Stephanie Shirley, who's now in her late 80s. And
yes, I've met her.
That's the approach that she's taken.
Exactly.
Yeah, that stuff. So yes, quite motivating how she's done that. Debbie, you've in the past supported Philanthropy Impact around the role that we're playing with professional advisors. Can you see professional advisors should be supporting their clients on their donor journey?
I think what's been really really striking about the research that you've done at Philanthropy Impact has been to see how a conversation between the donor and their advisor can really help open things up. And so I think that if in that conversation that it's possible to tease out where the donor's interest is. So are they interested in just alleviating some terrible need? Are they interested in really getting some kind of change, one particular policy they particularly feel strongly about, maybe to do with their business world or their personal, their family circumstances? Or are they somewhere in the middle where they might want to start thinking about a blended mix of stuff? And so I think very much what Edwina has been doing, that there's a big mix of that, isn't there, Edwina? You've funded some practice, you've funded inspirational speakers, you've funded direct work, you've funded campaigning, and so I'd say that's a kind of blend. But I think a conversation about to what extent does the donor, the individual, want to alleviate need, to how much do they want to change things in the future, is a very helpful way to go.
Thank you, Edwina. I want to ask questions too, but just another reminder that. Isa Bosch, I don't know if you know her, she's a German philanthropist, great-granddaughter of the founder of Bosch Industries, uses a really interesting approach called transformative philanthropy, which actually directly addresses the imbalance of power between the funder and the fundee. So I thought you might be interested in that. Sue, we've got about 2 minutes left, so I'm interested in what you see are innovations. So for example, the other day, I came across a private unpublished paper where they took SDGs and used SDGs to convince people that they should support their particular cause. It was really quite clever the way they use SDGs and stuff. But are there any innovations that you see in the sector that around campaigning that people should be aware of?
Sorry, the really big shift has obviously been the effect of digital and how quickly you can reach and engage people, and the emergence of big social movements that are the effect of Black Lives Matter in this last year has been extraordinary in terms of the impact it's had on how seriously that agenda is being taken across the board, including by very big institutions. But so in some ways, I think the challenge is to sort of keep abreast of how the whole business of how, in a broad sense, as a society, we decide what matters to us and how we push for change going forward, how all of that's working at any given moment, and the relationship that, the social sector and wider civil society is playing alongside the public sector and the private sector, of course, because in fact, another big development, I would say, is the private sector and the number of people, brands, who are themselves passionate about social causes and social goals and outcomes. And there's so much that we can do together. Someone had in the chat asked a question about the tension between building relationships versus direct action and protest. And it sort of comes back to me to the need to have a much more sort of sophisticated understanding of how we are driving change across all that we do. And exactly as Debbie and Edwina have set out, that actually you need to look almost cradle to grave at what's the evidence of the problem, right through to actually what your strategy and tactics is to drive change. And I think what would just be so welcome is if there were more philanthropists who really, I guess, understood all of that in the round and could very strategically invest money to support the sector to make the transformational change that actually can get much deeper into the problems, in concert with others, and obviously the UN and the SDGs, which have also just been very powerful, haven't they?
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Edwina, Debbie, and Sue. One final thing. We're just about out of time, but I'm going to extend the time a tiny bit. 30 seconds, final words of wisdom. Debbie, starting with you.
Start with somebody else, John.
Okay. Sue. 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Well, I would say the moment is now. It sounds a little overused, but coming through the last year that we have, it is a moment of such profound reflection, I think, societally, that there is a recharge and a reset moment, and a time to really be ambitious about the future that we want to build together. And I would just urge the philanthropic community to really sort of think deeply about the way in which it supports civil society to play its full role, because civil society is going to do more. We know that. The state is creaking, it's going to continue to creak, and civil society needs to do even more. So how can you help us play the biggest possible role in pushing for the deepest, most constructive change?
Okay, thank you. Debbie, are you ready now?
I am indeed. Yes, there's need is great, and there's a lot of money that's going into alleviating need. There's much less going into trying to create change. So every penny literally counts in this. Whereas within alleviating need, to some extent, it might be a bit of a drop in the ocean, but in creating change, a fairly small amount of investment will yield big returns over a period of time.
Great. And Edwina, the final word to you before we turn it back to Sophia.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I would say that systemic problems really do need systemic solutions, which is where I'm more focused now. And to anyone advising philanthropists, or to any philanthropists listening who want to sort of get more into their journey of giving, it's I would just say it's such fun, it's such an honour, it's a real responsibility, and I'd be happy to talk to any philanthropists that have about that, because it's just been one of the most fantastic things that has sort of happened to me, really. And I love my job, I love what I do, and I love where philanthropy takes me.
Well, it's good. And if you can encourage your professional advisors and their colleagues to actually support their clients in their donor journey, that would be wonderful. So thank you very much, everyone. Over to you, Sophie.
Yeah, thank you all. That was a really great session, and it's reflected in the chat because there's been loads of interactions. So thank you very much for making it really interesting. Yeah, so now on to next week. So please join us next week, where we'll be following on from this to explore how to support ultra and high net worth individuals on their donor journey right from the beginning. Wishing you all a wonderful week, and speak then. Bye.
Enjoy the sun.
Yeah, enjoy the sun.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.